Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was one of the most influential and controversial political figures of the 20th century. A man whose life became inseparable from the history of Cuba and the global struggle between competing political systems. Born on August 13, 1926, in the eastern Cuban province of Orient, Fidel Castro grew up on his father's sugar plantation. His father, Angel Castro, was a Spanish immigrant who became relatively wealthy, while his mother, Lina Ruz, came from a poor rural background. This combination exposed Fidel early on to both privilege and inequality, shaping his strong sense of social justice and resentment toward economic and political imbalance. Castro was educated in Catholic schools and later attended the University of Havana, where he studied law. During his student years, he became deeply involved in political activism. Cuba at that time was marked by corruption, social inequality, and political instability. In 1952, General Fulgencio Batista seized power in a military coup, suspending democratic processes and ruling the country with authoritarian control while maintaining close ties with the United States. Castro, angered by what he saw as injustice and foreign influence over Cuba's economy and politics, began to believe that armed struggle was the only way to bring real change. In 1953, Fidel Castro led a group of young revolutionaries in an attack on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. The assault was a failure, and many of the attackers were killed or arrested. Castro himself was captured and put on trial, where he delivered a famous speech in his own defense, later known as "History Will Absolve Me." In this speech, he outlined his vision for a more just Cuba, promising land reform, education, healthcare, and national sovereignty. He was sentenced to prison but was released in 1955 as part of a general amnesty. After his release, Castro went into exile in Mexico, where he regrouped with other revolutionaries, including his brother Raul Castro and the Argentine Dr. Ernesto Che Guevara. Together, they planned a guerrilla war against Batista's regime. In December 1956, Castro and his followers returned to Cuba aboard a small boat called the Grama. The landing was chaotic, and most of the group was killed or captured. But a small number, including Fidel, Raul, and Che, escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. From the mountains, Castro led a guerrilla campaign that gradually gained support from peasants and ordinary citizens frustrated with Batista's rule. The rebels promised land reform and an end to corruption, and Batista's army, weakened by poor morale and lack of popular support, struggled to defeat them. By late 1958, the revolutionary forces were advancing toward major cities. On January 1, 1959, Batista fled the country, and Fidel Castro emerged as the leader of the Cuban Revolution. At first, many Cubans and international observers viewed Castro as a nationalist reformer rather than a communist. However, once in power, he moved quickly to transform Cuba's political and economic system. His government nationalized large estates, banks, and industries, many of which were owned by American companies. These actions dramatically reduced U.S. influence in Cuba, but also led to a sharp deterioration in relations with the United States. In response, the U.S. imposed economic sanctions and eventually a trade embargo that would last for decades. As tensions with the United States increased, Castro turned to the Soviet Union for economic and military support. By the early 1960s, he openly declared Cuba a socialist state and aligned the country with the communist bloc. This alignment played a central role in one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the United States discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. The world came close to nuclear war. After intense negotiations, the crisis ended with the removal of the missiles, but Cuba remained isolated from much of the Western world. Domestically, Castro's government introduced sweeping social reforms. Education and healthcare became free and widely accessible, leading to significant improvements in literacy rates and public health. Cuba developed one of the most extensive healthcare systems in the developing world, and these achievements became a central part of Castro's legacy. At the same time, political opposition was tightly controlled. Independent media were eliminated, opposition parties were banned, and critics of the government often faced imprisonment or exile. Thousands of Cubans fled the island over the years, particularly to the United States. Creating a large and politically active Cuban diaspora, Fidel Castro ruled Cuba for nearly 5 decades, surviving numerous assassination attempts and outlasting many global political leaders. His charisma, long speeches, and defiant stance against U.S. power made him a symbol of resistance for some and a dictator for others. Internationally, he supported revolutionary movements in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, sending Cuban troops and doctors abroad in the name of solidarity. These actions earned Cuba influence far beyond its size, but also strained its limited resources. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked a turning point in Castro's rule. Cuba lost its main economic partner and entered a period of severe hardship known as the Special Period. Food, fuel, and basic goods became scarce, and the economy contracted sharply. Despite these challenges, Castro refused to abandon socialism, instead introducing limited economic reforms while maintaining strict political control. His ability to keep the system intact during this crisis reinforced his image as a resilient and determined leader. In 2006, due to declining health, Fidel Castro temporarily transferred power to his brother Raul, and in 2008, he officially stepped down as president. Although no longer in office, he continued to influence Cuban politics through writings and public statements. Fidel Castro died on November 25, 2016, at the age of 90, marking the end of an era in Cuban history. Today, Fidel Castro's legacy remains deeply divided. Supporters credit him with defending Cuba's sovereignty, improving education and healthcare, and standing up to powerful foreign interests. Critics argue that his long rule suppressed political freedom, limited economic opportunity, and forced many Cubans to leave their homeland. What is undeniable is that Fidel Castro profoundly shaped Cuba and left a lasting mark on world history. His life story is one of revolution, power, idealism, and controversy, reflecting the complex realities of the 20th century and the enduring struggle over how societies should be governed.